Snow fell relentlessly over the Colorado mountains, covering Highway 50 in blinding white. Lieutenant James Walker thought he was driving home to another quiet night with his son. Instead, he found investigative journalist Sarah Turner bleeding and hunted clutching proof that could destroy his entire police department. With his loyal canine Shadow and young Ethan at his side, James is pulled into a conspiracy that turns family against family. Will they survive the storm and uncover the truth? Watch till the end, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories. Snow fell, the way silence falls in a church after the last hymn. Slow at first, then thick enough to swallow the world. Lieutenant James Walker kept his Crown Vic steady on the mountain road, hands loose on the wheel, in the way old training teaches the heater, throwing hard-won warmth against the creeping cold. The wipers carved a narrow tunnel through white, and the headlights caught flakes tumbling like torn paper. Hunter, his retired canine, braced in the back seat with his paws spread, breath fogging the divider. Every few seconds, his ears flicked toward the trees, then settled again, as if the night were a conversation only he could hear. The radio murmured weather updates and stranded motorists. He kept it low, listening more to the tire hum and the faint, stubborn rattle in the passenger door he'd never gotten around to fixing. It was the kind of night decent people stayed home and foolish ones went looking for trouble. James had not meant to be on this road. He had left the precinct late after a shift that kept trying to grow new edges, pushed back only by coffee and the thin patience of men who know grief and routine share a border. Ethan would be waiting at the cabin with a half-finished model plane and a lamp left on in the window his boys' signal fire. The plan was simple. Check the East Ridge for a reported abandoned vehicle, then head up the last 6 miles and call it a night before the storm settled in for good. Plans have a way of shrinking under weather. The bend took him by surprise, not the curve itself. He knew every guardrail, every patch of black ice that reappeared like an old ache, but the sudden smear of taillight glow against the snowbank. He tapped the brakes and the tires answered clean. Ahead, canted at an awkward angle, sat a compact sedan, with its nose buried in a drift and the driver's side door yawning open. The car had come to rest partway off the shoulder snow packed around it like cement. The rear bumper hung crooked. Glass winked along the asphalt like a scatter of frozen stars. Hunter stood the low rumble rising in his chest, the sound he made when uncertainty put on a face. James pulled up short, hit the flashers, and stepped out into air that burned his teeth. The wind shoved at his coat and reached in under his collar. His breath plumed and faded. He scanned road tree line embankment, the shadowed gulch below mapping angles, listening for the wrong sound. The wrong sound arrived in the shape of a soft, strained voice from the far side of the sedan. Help. He pivoted around the trunk, hand hovering near his sidearm by habit, and found her half-sitting, half-folded against the rear wheel, a smear of blood darkening the side of her coat. Her hair was matted with snow. She cradled her left side with both hands, pressure held the way someone holds more than pain. She looked up and he saw 2 things at once: the professional focus of a person used to surviving long nights, and the exhaustion of someone who knows this one could be the last. "I've got you," he said, voice low to steady both of them. "I'm Lieutenant James Walker. We'll get you warm and to a hospital." Her eyes tracked to his badge, then snapped to his radio mic. She shook her head, quick, almost violent. "Don't call it in." The words crowded out her breath, left her swallowing air like water. "Please, not dispatch." He crouched his knees, complaining the way they had for the last 2 winters, and slid his coat off to wrap it around her shoulders. Up close, the blood at her side was tacky rather than fresh, a shallow but ugly groove where metal had kissed through layers. Nothing arterial, thank God, but nothing to ignore in wind like this. "You were hit?" he asked. "You spin out and catch a post?" She laughed without humor. A small broken noise that sounded more like a shiver. Pushed. Twice. They meant for the guardrail. I rode the drift. She leaned into the coat. James Walker, she said, tasting the name as if weighing whether the person matched the badge. I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm a reporter. I didn't put it in the trunk. They checked the trunk. Her right hand rose trembling, and he saw the flash drive clamped between her fingers as if she'd grown around it. Hunter moved forward, head low, and took air from above her shoulder, then cut his gaze toward the curve in the road behind them. The dog's body went hard as a drawn line. James felt that old familiar narrowing the way the world gets small around threat, and took it in order: the angle of the sedan, the absence of fresh tracks beyond the wreck, the scatter of plastic at the road's edge that did not belong to this make or model, the pattern of paint scrape on the rear quarter panel where something had kissed and shoved. Not a slide. Not tonight's first unlucky tourist. Someone had helped her lose control. He reached for the radio mic and stopped fingers on the ridged plastic. The pull to call it in was muscle deep. The oath to serve and protect comes tied to procedures that keep people alive. He could almost hear his training officer from a lifetime ago secure the scene request EMS notify command. Sarah's hand caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Please," she said again, more breath than sound. "Not your people. That's who did this." Even in the storm, the phrase "your people" had a weight to it. James let the mic fall back. "All right," he said. "Then it's just us for now. Can you stand?" She nodded, then grimaced when movement pulled at her side. He braced her, felt the tremor running through her, and guided her around the sedan to the cruiser. Hunter climbed in first and settled into the far corner, making room without being told, his gaze never leaving the road. James eased Sarah into the front seat, cranked the heat, and grabbed the small trauma kit he kept in the glove box. The light over the mirror was too harsh for comfort, but good for seeing. He cleaned and wrapped hands steady from more nights like this than he cared to count, and told her what he was doing as he did it. People do better when you talk them through. "They knew I'd be alone," she said, voice clearer as the warmth chewed at the cold. "I was headed to meet a federal contact. The time was a need to know. Someone knew." She lifted the flash drive and looked at it like it might bite her. "I got names, dates, what was taken out of evidence and where it went. It's not just one bad apple, it's an orchard with receipts." He watched her eyes as she spoke, the way they skittered past him to the windshield where snow kept smearing light. She was afraid, yes, but there was anger too, the clean kind that comes when a person decides fear alone won't pay the bill, Miss Mitchell, he said, and she shook her head. Sarah, my son is up that road. My dog knows where home is, but people do not. If I take you to my cabin, I put my child in whatever this is." He let the truth sit there because it needed to. "If I take you to the hospital, and you're right about the leak inside my house, we won't make it to triage before someone pulls the plug." She closed her eyes for a count of 3, then opened them steady. "I can't force you. I can only tell you that if you go through dispatch, they'll have a location on us before your heater hits full. If you go up the road, I will trust you with my life, and I will hand you everything I have. If you leave me here, I will probably fall asleep and not wake up." Hunter gave a single soft bark, the kind he used when a decision had already been made and the humans were late catching up. James looked at the dark shape of the ridge, at the way the storm had begun to wrap the trees in a muffled quiet, and felt a memory he didn't invite Allison's laugh as she stepped onto the porch with a blanket over her shoulders, saying the first snow always smelled like clean paper. She had been gone 3 years, and the ache had learned to live indoors, but on nights like this it found the door again. The cabin had a second bedroom with quilts folded tight and a kettle that whistled when the lid danced. Ethan had learned not to fear the wind when it tumbled down the chimney. The place had walls that had held. He made the choice the only way he knew, by imagining the story he would tell his son about the man he had been this night. He put the cruiser in gear. "Buckle up," he said. "We're going up." The tires found their grip and held. He kept his speed respectful of physics and mischief, guiding the car around the wreck and back into the narrow tunnel of white. Sarah angled the vent toward her hands and watched the road in a way that told him she counted distance in more than miles. Hunter stayed braced, attention split between them and the world. "You said it was your people," James said after a mile of silence measured by the metronome of the wipers. "Tell me how far this goes, and tell me before we climb all the way into it." She swallowed, then nodded. "You know most of it already. You've seen cases fall apart for no good reason and evidence go missing with a shrug. You've told yourself it was incompetence because that was easier than saying the word corruption out loud. Tonight it has a face." She held up the flash drive. "And a ledger." The road steepened, and with it the sense that something was climbing behind them too, a thought that made his shoulders set. "Names?" he asked. She named 3 he knew and 1 he had liked. She named a supplier who existed only as rumor. She named a meeting place he had driven past a dozen times without seeing. By the time the turnoff to his lane appeared a narrow bite taken out of the trees and draped in snow, he understood that the next hours were not going to give his boy the simple night he had promised. The cabin lights were not yet visible, but he could imagine them a small constellation stubborn against the dark. He signaled anyway habit and courtesy and took the turn. Behind them the storm thickened, which was either mercy or the prelude to worse. Neither man nor dog spoke the thought aloud. The climb up the narrow lane grew worse with each turn, snow falling heavier. Steering wheel tugging against James's hands. Headlights bouncing off walls of white, as if the road itself wanted to vanish beneath them. But the sight of his cabin finally appeared through the trees. A low glow spilling from the window where Ethan had left the lamp, burning a promise of warmth, and a reminder that this place had always been meant to be sanctuary. James pulled in carefully, crunching the tires over a path already softened by drifts, switched off the engine, and listened for a moment before moving, because silence after a long drive in storm tells a man more than sound. Hunter whined softly in the back, eager yet alert eyes fixed on the door as if he sensed the weight of the night had followed them home. James guided Sarah out of the cruiser, her movements slower now, fatigue and pain seeping through her composure, and with one arm bracing her, they crossed the porch where wind rattled the old screen door, then stepped into air that smelled of pine wood smoke and cinnamon from the cider. Ethan must have warmed earlier. Ethan appeared at the foot of the stairs, hair tousled from waiting the small model plane abandoned on the table, and the boy froze when he saw Sarah leaning against his father. "She needs a place to rest," James said gently, guiding Sarah to the couch near the fire, "and we are the only ones close enough to give it." Ethan nodded, though questions crowded his face, and Hunter moved to settle near Sarah's feet as if accepting the unspoken responsibility of guarding her. James worked quickly, setting water to boil, gathering bandages from the cabinet, checking the fire, all the quiet motions of a man used to putting a house in order when trouble entered it. Sarah unzipped her coat with shaky fingers, drew a breath as if steadying herself, then slipped a small object from the inside pocket and laid it on the table with deliberate care. The firelight glinted on the smooth casing of a flash drive, plain, almost ordinary, yet the way her hand lingered told them it was far from ordinary. James looked at her, and she said, "This holds everything. Names, records, transfers, case files. It reaches higher than most want to believe. Some of them you know." She closed her eyes briefly as if recalling each step she had taken to collect it, then opened them with quiet resolve. James did not reach for it right away. Instead, he studied her expression, weighed the cost of touching something that could not be untouched, then finally slid it closer with 2 fingers, the metal cold against his skin. He thought of the men at the precinct, the ones who had brought casseroles after Allison's funeral, who had ruffled Ethan's hair at barbecues, who had signed cards with steady hands, and now the possibility that their names might lie inside this tiny vessel of memory. Ethan had moved closer without realizing his curiosity pulling him, and though James's voice was calm when he asked his son to return to the stairs. The boy lingered long enough to hear Sarah whisper two names. Names that did not belong to distant strangers, but to officers who had sat at their table during summer cookouts. Ethan's eyes widened. His breath caught in a way that made James's chest ache, and he slipped back toward the staircase silently, the weight of betrayal already pressing on young shoulders. James noticed, but said nothing. There would be time later to soften what could not be erased. Sarah's voice steadied as she explained the pattern of evidence disappearing from lockers reports, rewritten suspects released, and how she had followed trails of altered signatures until the shape of a network emerged. James listened, the lines on his face deepening, every detail etching itself against his duty and his grief. And when she faltered, he pressed warm tea into her hands and told her to breathe, because truth cannot be rushed, even when it burns to be spoken. Hunter shifted at the window, ears twitching, nose close to the cold glass, as if listening to the storm for more than wind. James crossed to check the locks, pulled the heavy curtain, and returned to the fire. "You trust me with this?" he said quietly, nodding toward the drive. Sarah met his eyes and answered, "Because you still look at people straight when you talk to them. Most men in uniform stopped doing that a long time ago." The words landed heavier than praise because they carried expectation, too. James set the flash drive in the small tin box where Ethan kept baseball cards, slid it under the couch, and sat back, the decision already tying his night to hers. Ethan reappeared on the stairs, clutching his model plane again, but his gaze was troubled, his young mind working faster than his voice could shape. James beckoned him closer, ruffled his hair, told him gently that they had a guest who needed kindness, and Ethan nodded, though the knowledge he carried would not leave easily. Sarah leaned back, exhaustion dragging at her, yet she did not release the fire in her eyes, and James knew the storm outside was not the only one gathering. He tended the fire once more, the crackle filling the silence, and thought of the road that had led her here, the names that might lie inside the drive, and the boy upstairs who now looked at his father's world with different eyes. The storm thickened against the roof, promising they would not be left alone for long. The fire had settled into a steady rhythm, the wood snapping now and then as if the cabin itself were breathing. Sarah had dozed lightly with the blanket pulled to her chin, and Ethan had gone to his room. Though James knew the boy was not asleep, because children sense unease, the way dogs sense storms. James sat in the chair by the window, one hand resting near the rifle propped against the wall, eyes on the glass where snow swirled endlessly. But Hunter was the first to break the fragile quiet. The dog's body stiffened, ears cutting forward, and then a low growl rolled out from his chest, a warning that came from somewhere deeper than instinct. James rose immediately, crossed to the window, and at first saw nothing but shifting white, then caught the faint intrusion of light moving against the storm. Not lightning, not reflection, but the steady advance of headlights climbing the private road that should not have been found so easily. His stomach tightened, the knowledge clear they had been followed. He reached for the radio, clipped at his belt, thumbed it to life, and before he could even decide what to transmit, static filled the cabin, then broke clean with a voice he knew. "Lieutenant James Walker," the voice said, smooth, calm, and too familiar. "We know where you are. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." James froze in the middle of the room, the weight of recognition pressing harder than the storm. He had heard that voice countless times in the squad room, in briefings, even at his own table during Sunday meals. Hunter's growl deepened. His eyes locked on the window as the headlights came closer, painting the drifts with harsh slices of white. Ethan opened his door at the top of the stairs, his face, pale eyes wide with questions he did not speak. James lifted a hand to quiet him, his expression steady, though his pulse hammered. Sarah stirred, sat up slowly, and asked what he had already feared. "They found us, didn't they?" He nodded once. He clicked the radio again, held it near, and answered with measured tone. "This is Walker. You want to explain why my house looks like your next checkpoint?" The reply came with no hesitation. "We need the woman and what she carries. Step outside unarmed and this ends peacefully. Resist and you put your boy in danger." The last words carried a weight sharpened by knowledge. They were not guessing. They knew about Ethan, knew enough to use his name if they wished, though tonight they had chosen restraint perhaps to coax cooperation. James shut his eyes for a breath, then opened them, and what filled him was not fear but clarity. He had suspected since Sarah first spoke, but hearing that voice confirmed it. The hunters were not outsiders, not criminals in stolen uniforms, but his own men who wore the same badge, men who had carried his wife's coffin. The betrayal burned, but there was no time to dwell. He set the radio down, turned to Sarah, and whispered, "They will not stop. Not tonight. You told me it went higher. Now I know how high." She clutched the blanket tighter, her face pale but determined. "If they take me, the truth dies. If they take the drive, the story ends here. You know that." He did. He glanced at Ethan, whose small hands gripped the railing and forced a smile to calm him, though the boy's eyes searched his father's for answers too large for his age. "Back to your room," James said gently, and though Ethan hesitated, he obeyed, retreating slowly, Hunter shifting to keep himself between the boy and the window. The headlights outside multiplied 3 distinct beams, now cutting across the storm vehicles, moving with slow precision, the kind of advance that said, "Tactics, not panic." James went to the cabinet, retrieved a pair of binoculars, and peered through the narrow slit in the curtain. Dark shapes moved around the lead vehicle, men braced against the wind, rifles slung but ready, their formation practiced. His heart clenched at the sight, not for the danger, but for the familiarity of their stances. These were not strangers. He lowered the binoculars, set them down carefully, and drew a breath. The radio crackled again. "James, think about your son. We do not want this to end badly. You hand her over, you walk away clean." The words were poison wrapped in reason. He lifted the mic, pressed the button, and said, "You talk about peace like you forgot what it means. You expect me to give up an unarmed civilian in my care. You know I will not do that." Silence answered thick. Then the voice came again, colder now. "Then you are choosing sides, Walker. That is your decision." James set the mic down once more, his jaw tight. He turned to Sarah and said, "They are here for you, but they are willing to burn everything in their way. We need to move before they decide to breach." She nodded, her hands trembling but her gaze clear. "I will not ask you to risk Ethan. If it comes to it, leave me." His reply was firm. "We stay together." He gathered supplies with swift economy water ammunition, the medical kit, Ethan's winter gear. Sarah rose slowly, leaning on the arm of the couch, her strength tested but not broken. Hunter paced by the door body, taut, every muscle ready. James slung the rifle across his shoulder, checked the sidearm, and pulled Ethan's coat from the hook. The boy appeared again, eyes questioning, but before he could speak, the voice outside boomed through a loudspeaker, louder now carried by the storm. "James Walker, last chance. Come out now." The cabin seemed smaller suddenly, its walls thin against the weight pressing in. James looked at his son, at Sarah, at the dog who had never left his side, and knew the night had shifted from refuge to siege. He opened the door just a crack, cold rushing in headlights, glaring against the snow, and whispered to his family, "Stay ready. This is just beginning." James closed the cabin door gently, careful not to let the slam carry through the storm, then turned quickly to Sarah and Ethan, his voice low but firm as he told them they could not remain. Sarah pulled herself upright, despite the pain, her jaw set with the kind of resolve born from knowing that hesitation now would cost lives. Ethan clutched his winter coat, his eyes darting between his father and the window where light still pushed through the falling snow. Hunter circled once by the door tail, stiff, his instincts already ahead of everyone else in the room. James stuffed supplies into the canvas pack bandages, water extra ammunition matches, Ethan's gloves, and handed Ethan the wool cap his mother had knitted years ago, the one still stretched slightly from when she used to pull it over his ears with a laugh. "Stay close, no noise unless I tell you," James whispered, and Ethan nodded, the seriousness of his small face showing he understood. James led them through the back door into the storm snow instantly lashing against exposed skin, the night swallowing sound except for the faint hum of engines from the road behind. The trees closed around them as they moved down a trail only James and Ethan knew, branches bending under weight of ice snow crunching beneath boots, every step a careful balance between speed and silence. Sarah pressed on with surprising strength, though he could hear her breath catching each time pain pulled at her side, but she did not complain. Hunter stayed ahead, weaving a line that guided them deeper into cover, pausing now and then to test the air before pushing forward again. After several minutes of relentless movement, when the headlights behind them had dimmed to smudges against the storm, Sarah finally spoke in a voice that trembled less from cold than from confession. "I need you to know something," she said, stumbling slightly but recovering as James steadied her. "Tonight I was supposed to meet a federal contact, someone from Denver, who has been helping me piece this together. Only 2 people knew the exact time and place, and yet the ambush was waiting. That means someone inside leaked it." James slowed, letting the weight of her words settle in the snow around them. "You are saying this goes beyond Cedar Falls," he murmured. Sarah nodded, her eyes hard. "It reaches higher, and now they know you are part of it even if unwilling. They will not stop." James looked down at Ethan, who trudged with quiet determination and felt anger rise sharp against the cold. Betrayal from within had always been the most dangerous enemy, and now it breathed down his neck. He tightened his grip on the rifle and urged them forward. The trail bent downward into a shallow ravine, where the trees thickened, offering temporary cover. But before relief could take hold, Hunter froze his ears forward, body rigid. A second later, James heard it too faint at first, then growing a mechanical snarl rising and falling with the rhythm of engines tuned for power. Snowmobiles. James's chest tightened as the sound multiplied, no longer just 1 or 2, but several, spreading like hunting dogs through the night. He crouched, signaling Ethan to press against the embankment, and Sarah sank beside him, her face pale, her breath misting rapidly. James closed his eyes briefly, listening. These were not the uneven, hesitant revs of locals braving a storm. The engines were synchronized, disciplined, advancing in coordinated arcs. He had trained with men who moved like that, and he knew at once that this was no amateur pursuit. "Not locals," James said quietly. "This is tactical. Someone sent in trained units." Sarah met his eyes, the snow clinging to her lashes, and whispered, "Then they must have clearance from higher up. Ordinary officers would not risk this in a storm. This is sanctioned." Ethan pressed closer to his father, his hand gripping the strap of James's coat, his silence more telling than fear. James considered their options quickly. The ravine offered concealment, but not escape if the snowmobiles pressed too close. The ranger station lay northeast, but they would never reach it before interception. He decided to veer off the familiar trail toward an older hunting path, one overgrown and nearly erased by winters past, but still navigable if you knew where to look. He signaled Hunter, who immediately moved left, pressing into the thicker trees, carving a narrow tunnel for them to follow. As they moved, the growl of the snowmobiles grew louder, closer, weaving through the forest with methodical patience. Sarah stumbled again, catching herself, and James pulled her arm over his shoulder, redistributing her weight without breaking stride. Ethan mirrored Hunter's pace, every bit the son of a man trained to survive. They pressed deeper, the forest swallowing them, but James knew the hunters were not far behind. The night had become a chessboard, each move forcing them closer to the truth Sarah carried and the danger that truth had invited. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, his eyes narrowing as the storm thickened, and whispered, "Stay quiet. Stay low. This is only the beginning." The ravine narrowed into a dark funnel where trees leaned close and snow packed heavy on every branch, muffling sound, but James knew the machines were closing because their engines surged in waves that broke against the forest like a tide. Hunter's hackles rose, the dog pausing to glance back before pushing ahead, and Ethan pressed close to his father's side with a determination far beyond his years. Sarah stumbled once more, breath ragged, yet she refused to stop, and James adjusted his pace, supporting her without losing momentum. They reached a split in the trail where one branch bent deeper into shadow, and James made the call, instantly steering them left where the terrain pitched upward. The climb was brutal each step through thigh-deep snow, but it forced the snowmobiles to slow engines growling as they fought the incline. James paused long enough to position Sarah and Ethan against a large pine, whispered for them to stay low, then motioned Hunter to guard them. He slipped into the undergrowth, his training returning as naturally as breath, every sense sharpening. The first pursuer appeared moments later, a man in tactical winter gear, moving with the surety of someone who had drilled in conditions like these. James waited until the figure was almost level, then burst from cover, striking low and hard, the element of surprise tipping the balance. The man went down into the snow, struggling, but James's weight and precision held him. With quick efficiency, James disarmed him, driving a knee into his back while stripping the rifle from his hands. The man gasped, tried to reach for his belt, but James yanked his arm up and pressed him still. In the glow of the falling snow, James saw the insignia stitched on the man's vest. Regulation issue, his gear marked with departmental codes, James recognized immediately. It was not stolen equipment. This was official. James's stomach twisted, confirmation of what Sarah had claimed. This operation had the blessing of command. He pulled the man's radio free, tucked it into his pocket, then used cord from his own pack to bind the man's wrists and ankles. Leaving him alive was a risk, but killing him would make James something his son could never look at the same way. He pushed the subdued pursuer deeper into brush, covering him with branches, then retrieved the rifle and returned to his family. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the weapon and the insignia, but James only shook his head once, as if to say the truth was already known. Ethan looked at the rifle too, his expression caught between fear and the realization that the men who once shook his hand at picnics now hunted them with state-issued firepower. James crouched, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, steadying him, then whispered, "We keep moving. Stay with Hunter." They pressed forward again, the forest thickening around them, snowmobiles now weaving in arcs that suggested coordination. James realized the hunters were not just following tracks. They were working a grid. He urged Sarah forward faster, despite her wound. Then Hunter froze mid-step, his body lowering, his gaze locked on the ridge above them. A low growl rolled out deeper than before, warning of a threat not yet seen. James followed the dog's stare, squinting into the snow. At first he saw nothing but the ridge, then the faintest glint of glass, too steady to be accident. It was the reflection of a scope. A sniper. James's breath tightened in his chest. The hunters below were not meant to capture. They were meant to drive to flush him and his family into the line of sight of the man above. It was a textbook kill box, the kind of plan crafted by professionals. He crouched low, motioning Sarah and Ethan to flatten themselves against the snow. Sarah's face paled further, her hand clutching the blanket around her, but she obeyed without argument. Ethan pressed himself down, his eyes darting to his father, trusting without question. James studied the ridge, calculating distance and angle. The sniper had the advantage of height, but visibility was broken by the storm. James knew the man would be using thermal optics, which meant their body heat shone like lanterns against the cold. He stripped off his own jacket quickly, draping it over a nearby log to create a false signature, then urged Hunter to move wide through the trees, circling behind cover. The dog went without hesitation, his form blending into the storm, a silent shadow in a world of white. Moments later, a shot cracked through the forest, sharp and precise, striking the log where the jacket rested, snow exploding outward. The confirmation chilled James more than the wind. This was no warning shot. It was intended to kill, James took aim with the rifle he had taken, fired a controlled burst toward the ridge, not to hit, but to disrupt, to make the sniper reposition. He pulled Sarah and Ethan further into cover, whispering, "We move now." They scrambled, half-crawling the snow, stealing breath, but movement was survival. Another shot rang out, close chipping bark above Sarah's head. James turned eyes narrowing and pressed them forward harder. From the ridge came no shouts, no taunts, only silence and the cold efficiency of professionals. James understood the truth now, beyond doubt. This was sanctioned, organized, approved by someone with authority and resources. Not a rogue action, not an accident. A mission with one purpose: eliminate. They pushed deeper into the forest, Hunter rejoining them, his fur dusted with snow, his eyes still locked on the ridge as if memorizing the sniper's scent. James guided them toward a cluster of rock outcroppings he knew from past hikes, a temporary shield. As they moved, his mind worked through the implications. Evidence this large, names this high, and now killed teams with official gear meant they were entangled in something larger than one town. He looked at Sarah, who clutched the drive as if it were her pulse, and then at Ethan, whose trust demanded he make choices that would let them see tomorrow. The storm howled around them, but James could still hear the engines circling and knew they were not yet safe. The outcroppings gave brief shelter, but James knew they would not hold for long against the sweep of snowmobiles and the silent patience of the sniper above. He pressed onward, guiding Sarah and Ethan along a hidden cut in the slope, his breath a steady rhythm of focus. Hunter led them faithfully, his form black against the storm's white fury, his nose tilting toward the northeast, where James's memory placed the abandoned ranger station. It had been shuttered years before, a relic of older days when the forest had been patrolled with regularity, but James remembered the stone base and heavy beams that could still provide protection if nothing else could. Sarah stumbled, her strength fading, and Ethan slipped under her arm without being asked, the boy's small frame carrying weight his years should not have known. James's heart tightened at the sight, but he kept them moving until the dark square of the station emerged through the storm. Its roof sagged under snow shutters, half-hanging door crooked, but it was shelter, and more importantly, it was defensible. James forced the door, the wood giving with a crack, and ushered them inside. The air was stale, touched with mildew, but dry. He set Sarah against a bench, checked her bandage quickly, then stoked the old fireplace with kindling left from years past. The flames caught reluctantly, then grew, painting the room with amber light. Ethan curled beside Hunter, exhaustion finally catching up, while Sarah clutched the flash drive as if it were her heartbeat. James sat up near the window, scanning through the cracks, rifle steady, waiting for the hunters to show. The engines faded, then circled, then stopped altogether. Silence pressed heavy, the kind that means calculation. Then a voice broke it, booming through a portable loudspeaker carried by the storm, yet cutting through as clear as memory. "Lieutenant James Walker," the voice said. "You know who this is?" James felt his chest tighten as recognition struck deeper and more personal than before. He would have known that voice anywhere, though he had not expected it here. Captain John Mercer, his brother-in-law. Allison's older brother, the man who had stood beside him at her grave. The man who had been uncle to Ethan. Now spoke from the darkness outside with authority that told James he was leading the hunters. James lowered the rifle slightly, his breath heavy. Sarah looked at him, confusion and alarm crossing her features. Ethan stirred, sensing the shift, whispering, "Uncle John." James nodded once, the weight of betrayal heavy in his bones. The loudspeaker crackled again. "James, do not make this harder. Hand over the reporter and what she carries. You and Ethan can walk away. I give you my word." His word, once sacred in their family, now hung bitter in the air. James pressed the button on his own radio, his voice steady, though fire burned beneath. "John, you are leading this. You brought armed men to my cabin, chased us through the forest, hunted Ethan like quarry. Explain yourself before I answer." The reply came after a pause. slower, heavy with strain. "It is not what you think. I did not choose this. They have leverage, James. Years of financial records, things that would destroy everything if revealed. If I resist, my family loses everything. If I obey, at least I can control how far it goes." James closed his eyes, hearing Allison's laugh in memory, the echo of family dinners where John's children and Ethan had played together without fear. Now those same children were used as chains around their father's neck. "You are telling me you are blackmailed into betraying the oath you swore," James said quietly. "But you know as well as I do that the men outside would not stop with Sarah. They will bury us all." John's voice hardened. "I am giving you an out. I begged them to let me speak to you first. Hand her over, and you can keep Ethan safe. You think this is about justice, but it is about survival. You cannot fight the whole department, James," Sarah whispered fiercely. "If he takes me, the truth dies. Every name in this drive walks free. Every child who suffers from their crimes remains invisible." James looked at her, then at Ethan, who clutched Hunter's collar, eyes filled with confusion, but also trust. The storm howled against the shutters, but inside, the silence was heavier. James pressed the radio again. "John, you once told me that nothing mattered more than family. Tonight, I am holding mine close. Do not ask me to give up someone who trusted me with her life. Do not ask me to teach my son that compromise is the same as honor." The radio hissed, then John's voice returned quieter, now tinged with sorrow. "Then you are leaving me no choice, brother. They will come. And when they do, I may not be able to shield you." James lowered the radio, his grip firm on the rifle, his mind clear. Outside, he could hear men moving into position, boots crunching in snow, orders carried faintly. Inside, Sarah sat taller. Despite her wound, Ethan pressed against Hunter for warmth and courage, and James stood by the window ready for what the storm would bring next. The wind pressed against the ranger station like a living thing, rattling the shutters and making the beams creak. But inside, the fire held steady, a stubborn glow against the storm. James sat at the table with the flash drive resting in his palm, the weight of it far greater than its size, while Sarah leaned forward, her voice low, insisting that he see what she had risked everything to gather. Ethan sat near Hunter on the floor, the boy tracing lines on the dog's fur with nervous fingers, trying to distract himself from the muffled sounds of men repositioning outside. Sarah reached into her coat pocket, producing a small recorder she had hidden with more care than her own safety. She slid it across the table toward James, who hesitated before pressing play. The crackle of static filled the room first. Then a conversation unfolded, voices he recognized not from rumor, but from years of shared service. They spoke casually about evidence being redirected, about a shipment that never reached the evidence locker, about cash disappearing into channels disguised as charity donations. Then came a voice that cut James to the bone. It was John Mercer. Calm, authoritative, the voice of a man used to command, giving orders to bury a report, to classify a file as inconclusive, to release a suspect under false pretense. James stopped the recorder abruptly, his breath-heavy eyes closing for a moment as if he had been struck. Sarah's voice steadied. "You see now, he is not just a man forced into obedience. He has been part of it for years. Blackmail may keep him bound now, but his hands were dirty long before tonight." James stared at the recorder, torn between disbelief and the clarity of proof. Memories of Mercer's loyalty after Allison's death clashed violently with the sound of his voice orchestrating corruption. The truth was no longer deniable. James's duty was no longer conflicted by loyalty. It was sharpened by betrayal. Ethan, sensing the shift in his father's silence, looked up with wide eyes. "Uncle John," he whispered. James forced himself to meet his son's gaze. "Not the man you thought, Ethan. Not the man I thought." The words weighed heavy, but he would not shield his son from reality. Lies had brought them here, and truth was the only way forward. Hunter growled softly, his attention shifting toward a shadow near the far wall. James followed the dog's gaze and noticed Ethan fiddling with an old piece of equipment tucked on a shelf, an ancient CB radio left from when the station had been operational. Its knobs were stiff, but when Ethan twisted one out of curiosity, a faint light flickered to life and static hissed. James crossed the room quickly, reaching for the set, but not before a burst of sound traveled through the storm, a carrier wave broadcasting their presence to anyone listening on the right channel. He snapped the radio off, but the damage was done. Sarah's face tightened. They will have heard that. James nodded grimly, but his mind worked through possibilities. The frequency had been broad, not encrypted. While it risked drawing the hunters closer, it also meant that anyone scanning could have picked it up. Old rangers, truckers, perhaps even the federal contact Sarah had tried to meet. The risk of exposure was matched by the sliver of hope that allies might now know where to look. Outside, the storm-shifted headlights moved across the tree line, voices carried faintly. James crouched by the window, eyes narrowing as he saw figures advancing in formation, careful and deliberate. They were preparing to close in. He returned to the table, sliding the recorder back into Sarah's hands. "This evidence changes everything," he said quietly. "It means Mercer is not a prisoner of circumstance. He is part of the machine. If we get this to the right people, it tears them apart. But if we fail, it dies with us here." Sarah nodded, her grip tightening on the recorder. "Then we cannot fail." Ethan clutched Hunter tighter. The boy's courage mixed with fear, but James could see the fire beginning to kindle in his eyes. The storm pressed harder against the walls, and footsteps in the snow grew nearer. James adjusted his rifle, checked his pack, and whispered to both of them, "Whatever happens next, stay close. This night is not finished." The ranger station walls groaned against the storm, but inside the fire burned low, its warmth uneven shadows stretching long across the cracked floorboards. James sat near the window, his rifle balanced on his knees, watching the tree line through narrow slits where moonlight and headlights fought the snow. Hunter lay at the door, every muscle taut, ears shifting to track movement outside. Ethan sat close to Sarah, trying to hide his fear by reading from an old field guide left on a shelf, his voice quiet but steady, a boy's attempt to bring normalcy into a night that had none. Sarah leaned back against the bench, her face pale, sweat dampening her brow, her breathing ragged from the fever that had begun to take hold. James crouched beside her, checked the bandage, and saw the infection spreading despite his care. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "James," she whispered, "if I do not make it, you need to know. I did not keep everything on that drive. I sent part of it already to an editor I trust. He has the copies. If they kill me tonight, it will not matter. The story will still come." James froze for a moment, her words settling like a hammer against the fragile balance of the night. He had carried the fear that everything rested on one small device, but now he realized her safety was not just about information, it was about principle. Sarah coughed, winced, and forced a faint smile. "They think silencing me is enough. They are already too late." James pressed a hand against her shoulder, steadying her, though inside he felt the weight of responsibility deepen. "Rest," he told her softly. "We still need you alive to see it through." Ethan leaned closer, whispering, "She will be okay, right?" James nodded gently, though certainty was a luxury he did not have. The storm outside shifted, carrying faint voices, boots crunching and snow orders being relayed. James adjusted his rifle again, his instincts warning him that the pressure around them was building. Then the radio on his belt crackled softly, not the booming command from earlier, but a quiet private channel. James lifted it, pressed it close, and heard John Mercer's voice, subdued, stripped of the authority it had carried before. "James, listen to me. You are running out of time. The men you see outside, they are the first wave. They were told to corner you, push you, maybe give you a chance. But another team is on its way, men who do not carry badges, men who will not hesitate. When they arrive, I will not be able to hold them back. You need to be gone before then." James's jaw tightened. "You are still choosing their side, John. You could stop this." The voice came again, heavy with something close to shame. "I cannot. You do not understand. They hold records my investments accounts I thought were clean. If those files come out, it will destroy my children's future, tear apart everything Allison's family built. I made choices years ago, small compromises, and now I am trapped. I never thought it would come to this." James glanced at Ethan, who leaned against Hunter Innocence, wrapped in exhaustion, and felt anger rise against his brother-in-law's rationalizations. "You think this is about saving your name," James said quietly into the radio. "But it is about lives. My son's. Hers." He looked at Sarah, who had drifted into a shallow sleep, her breathing uneven. Silence answered him for a long moment. Then John whispered, "I know. That is why I am telling you what is coming. Do not waste time debating. Leave. Because if they find you still here when the second team arrives, nothing I say will matter." James clicked the radio off his chest tight, caught between fury and the faint thread of humanity that Mercer's warning carried. He turned to Ethan, pulled him close, and whispered, "We may have to move again soon. Be ready." The boy nodded, his face pale but resolute. James checked Sarah's condition once more, then began gathering supplies into the pack again, his movements efficient, quiet. Hunter lifted his head ears, flicking toward the door, already sensing the shift. Outside, the storm had eased slightly, and with it came clearer sounds of the men surrounding them. The pressure was closing in, and James knew Mercer's warning had not been a bluff. He adjusted the rifle strap, tested the weight of the pack, and whispered to himself, as much as to his family, "The night is not finished. We move before the darkness gets deeper." The night had grown quieter, and that stillness carried more danger than the roar of snowmobiles or the crack of rifles. James kept his rifle braced against his shoulder as he scanned the tree line, Sarah resting weakly against the bench. Ethan sitting close with Hunter's head in his lap. The boy's eyes were too wide, his face too pale, but he had not cried, and James recognized that kind of courage in silence. He whispered that they would soon move, that Uncle John's warning had given them a narrow chance, but before he could act, the first canister broke through the shutter with a crash. It clattered across the floor, hissing, and within seconds, the room filled with choking white smoke. Sarah coughed violently. Ethan's eyes watered, and Hunter barked furiously, pawing the air as the fog thickened. James grabbed Sarah, pulled Ethan close, and forced them toward the trap door he had noticed beneath warped planks near the rear wall. He kicked the boards aside, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Down he commanded, lowering Ethan first, then helping Sarah. The smoke stung his throat, his eyes burning, but he forced himself last, pulling the trapdoor closed above them as boots thundered against the porch outside. The air below was damp, stale, but free of gas. James steadied Sarah against the rough stone wall and lit a small lantern hanging from a hook. Its glow revealed what he had not expected, a passageway stretching deeper beneath the station built from rough-cut timbers, long abandoned but still holding. He realized it must have been an old supply tunnel forgotten by time, unknown even to those now surrounding the station. Hope flared in his chest, not for safety but for another chance. He motioned them forward, Hunter leading with ears pricked, Ethan's small hand gripping the back of James's coat. They moved quickly, the sound of shouting muffled above as the attackers stormed empty rooms, their quarry already beneath their feet. The tunnel twisted, sloped downward, and opened into a wider chamber where broken crates and rusted tools lay scattered. James paused to orient himself, trying to match memory with this hidden route, then urged them on toward where he guessed the forest might reclaim its edge. But chaos found them still. A side door in the tunnel burst inward, one of the hunters dropping through with practiced speed. His weapon swung toward Ethan, his voice sharp as he ordered the boy forward. For one frozen instant, James felt the world narrow to that sight. His son threatened his rifle too far to raise in time. Then Hunter moved. The dog launched from the shadows with a growl that shook the tunnel, his weight slamming into the man's chest. They crashed hard, the weapon clattering across stone. Hunter's jaws locked on the man's arm, pinning him. But James noticed something even in that fury. Hunter did not kill. His teeth held with strength enough to break, but he stopped short, controlling, dominating, refusing to cross into cruelty. Ethan's breath caught, and James saw the boy's fear shift into something else understanding. Courage was not blind rage. It was control. It was the strength to stop where others might destroy. James pulled the rifle up, covering the attacker as Hunter held him down. He motioned Ethan and Sarah forward, whispering firmly, "Keep moving." Sarah staggered but obeyed Ethan at her side, his eyes never leaving Hunter until the dog released his grip and rejoined them, leaving the subdued man gasping but alive. James herded them deeper into the passage, his senses alert for more intruders, his heart pounding from the close call. The tunnel stretched on, curving, until at last he felt fresh air stirring cold and sharp against his face. The exit appeared ahead, half hidden by roots and snow pressed against old timbers. James pushed through, forcing the hatch open with his shoulder, and they spilled into the night once more, the storm washing over them like baptism. The forest lay dark, vast, and filled with danger, but it was freedom from the trap of the station. James looked back at the hidden door, knowing Mercer had not known of it, and that ignorance had given them one last escape. Sarah leaned heavily against a tree, her fever worsening, but her eyes still fierce. Ethan crouched beside Hunter, whispering praise to the dog, his small hands burying in thick fur, a bond sealed by trust and survival. James adjusted his rifle, scanning the forest where faint lights moved in the distance. The battle was not done, but the night had shifted. They had escaped the cage carrying both truth and the fragile hope that still lived in their small group. The snow had eased into a steady fall, each flake drifting with deceptive calm. But the clearing where James, Sarah, Ethan, and Hunter stood was heavy with tension. Opposite them, Mercer's line advanced boots crunching in rhythm rifles steady their formation precise, a trap closing with inevitability. Mercer's voice rang across the frozen space, no longer pleading but commanding, sharp and final. "You cannot win this, James. Hand her over. Keep your son safe and walk away." James drew Sarah closer, steadying her against his side, Ethan gripping his father's coat while Hunter pressed forward. Low growl warning of the danger around them. James lifted his rifle and called back, "You still have a choice, John. This is not the way to end it." For a moment, Mercer hesitated, the flicker of family memory in his eyes, but then he hardened, lifting his hand in signal. Before he could give the order, the tree line behind them exploded with light. Floodlamps pierced the storm. Voices thundered through loudspeakers. Federal agents, weapons down. "This area is secured." Dark figures surged forward with tactical precision, their vehicles breaking through the forest, their timing exact. Sarah's eyes widened, her voice trembling with relief. "It worked, the files I sent the signal. They found us." Mercer's men faltered, some lowering weapons, others looking to their commander for direction. The sudden presence of federal forces broke their certainty, exposing the corruption not as untouchable, but hunted. Mercer stood frozen, his hand still raised, his eyes shifting between the men behind him, the agents advancing and James holding his family together. The weight of years bore down the choices he had made to protect his own image, the compromises that had chained him, and now the sight of his nephew's face staring back with both trust and heartbreak. The decision broke through him with visible force. Slowly, he lowered his weapon, his voice no longer a command, but a confession that carried across the clearing. "I will testify. Every order, every file, every meeting I buried, I will name them all." His men froze, disbelief clear. Then some began to drop their weapons as the authority of his surrender spread like cracks in ice. Federal agents moved quickly, securing the hunters, seizing evidence, placing Mercer in custody, not as silent prisoner, but as the key witness who had chosen at last to stand. James lowered his rifle, the adrenaline in his chest giving way to exhaustion and relief. He turned to Sarah, her body weak, but her eyes bright with vindication. Ethan pressed against him, his voice small but steady. "It's over, right?" James knelt, pulling him close, whispering, "Yes, son, it's over." Hunter barked once, sharp and clear as though sealing the moment with certainty. Hours passed and the clearing transformed from battlefield to investigation site. Radios crackled, agents cataloged weapons, and files vehicles carried the detained men away. Sarah received medical attention, her fever easing as antibiotics were finally administered, and James never left her side. Ethan sat near Hunter's head across his lap, the boy's hand stroking fur with absent comfort. For the first time in a long time, the weight on James's shoulders lifted, not gone, but shared the promise of justice, replacing the shadow of endless flight. Weeks later, the snow melted into spring. Cedar Falls filled headlines as federal trials began, names once untouchable dragged into light. Mercer testified at length, his words dismantling the network he had once protected, his shame public, but his cooperation undeniable. Sarah stood before courts and cameras, not as victim, but as survivor. Her reporting validated her truth unstoppable. Through it all, she returned often to the cabin, sometimes with files to review, sometimes simply to sit by the fire with James and Ethan, her presence no longer intrusion, but belonging. Ethan quickly grew attached, leaving drawings on her desk, asking if she would stay for dinner, telling her she was part of their story now. Hunter seemed to agree, shadowing her steps as though she had always been in their pack. One evening, months after the storm, Sarah stood on the porch with James as dusk painted the mountains gold. Ethan played in the yard, Shadow bounding happily beside him, their laughter carrying into the warm air. Sarah turned, her voice quiet but steady. "You could have walked away that night. You chose to fight instead, not just for me, but for the truth. I don't know how to repay that." James looked at her, the grief of years softened by the peace he now felt, and answered simply, "Stay. That's all." She smiled, reached for his hand, and their silence said the rest. Inside, the fire burned low, casting gentle light on walls that had seen fear survival, and now renewal. The storm was behind them, the trials ahead still daunting, but the path forward was no longer one. James walked alone, together with Sarah at his side, Ethan at his heart, and Hunter guarding them still. They stepped into a life no longer defined by loss, but by the family they had chosen, forged not by blood alone, but by courage, loyalty, and love. And that's how James, Sarah, Ethan, and Shadow stepped out of the storm into a new beginning. What would you have done if you were in James's place? Protect your family at all costs, or risk everything for the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories.